Hello, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today I will be talking about the last full novel that I will be reading in 2023. I think I might do one more short story video before the year is out, but the last novel that I have read in 2023 is the novel Julia by Peter Straub. This book came out in 1975. This is my first edition book club copy. It's not an actual first, but it is the book club. Came out around the same time, but the book club or the non-book club would have, of course, the price on the inner flap here. Better cover than we've seen thus far. I like this. There's actually kind of an artistic thing going on here with the out of focus ghost of a child, which of course is what this novel's about, a haunting of a child. This is the copy that I read. You'll notice it has a different title, Full Circle. There are two names for this book. It's either Julia or Full Circle. And I think the Full Circle, I don't know, I can't figure out the publishing history of when Full Circle came around, but I do know that the movie The Haunting of Julia, or the movie about Julia, is called The Haunting of Julia or Full Circle. So this might be a movie tie-in. I have no idea, but I love this cover much more than the other one. Real stylized picture of a child looking through a window with rain on it and putting her fingers on the window pane, and there's blood running down her fingers. This is 70s cover art that I expect. It's wonderful. Really, really wonderful cover art. So this book is an incredible haunted house story that looks at the kind of life-shattering reality of what being haunted would actually be like. And that is really what made it stand out for me. Our main character, Julia Lofting, is an unreliable narrator. We question her sanity throughout the entire book, as does she, which really makes us question even more. But in the end, I do believe that Peter Straub expected us to believe in the haunting, and I certainly did, which is why I would classify this as supernatural horror fiction, which is my favorite kind. For me, this novel seems closer to magical realism than it does a regular horror novel. And I think once we get into the history of the writing of this novel, we can kind of see why. But that's what made it very enjoyable for me, was the fact that the supernatural event, the haunting in this, occurs like it does in a magical realism novel, where it's explained and shown, but then the rest of the novel takes shape around the concept of seeing how people would deal in a realistic way with this supernatural event. And that's what kept me reading. And I read this really quickly because it was quite the page turner. It dips a little right before the climax, and I found myself having to trudge through a little bit, but overall, from beginning to end, I thought the pacing of this was incredible, and the reading of it was very simple and enjoyable. I highly recommend it. Just a quick history of how this book came about. Peter Straub is an American writer. He got most of his education in America, and then he decided that he wanted to move to Dublin to get his doctorate degree. While he was in Dublin, he started writing. I don't think he ever finished his doctorate there in Dublin, but he did publish his first novel. It was published through an American company, and it was called Marriages. It was published in 1973. It didn't really go anywhere, but he immediately started working on a second novel, which was called Under Venus. And that one he showed to his publishers, and they weren't really interested in it. Now, there's two stories that I've found on the internet and through interviews about why Peter Straub decided to write a horror novel for his third novel. The first story that I was able to find is that his publishers, in order to encourage him to keep writing, told him that he should try to write a horror novel, as that was what was really selling at the time. However, I did find another quote from him in an interview where he says that he himself, after finding that his publishers weren't interested in his second novel, sat down and looked at what was really popular at the time there in the early 70s. And he came across the three kind of most popular novels of the early 70s: The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin, and The Other by Thomas Tryon. And of course, he noticed that they were all horror novels, and that they were all doing very well. And he also noticed that there wasn't much other horror around for people to read. So he decided to fill that gap and wrote Julia, which is his first supernatural novel. And of course, he stuck in that vein for quite a long time. Most of his books fall in the horror genre, although only the first 4 or 5, I think. Julia, If You Could See Me Now, Ghost Story. Actually, yeah, those 3. Oh no, Shadowlands, I think, is one of his. Yeah, those 4 are supernatural horror, and then he got more into psychological thriller after that. Just a quick synopsis of the novel. This novel tells the story of Julia Lofting, an American woman in her 30s who is living in London when this story takes place. The novel begins just as Julia has been released from a psychiatric hospital. She was in the hospital because she and her husband recently lost their daughter, Kate, who I think was either 10 or 11. They lost her to choking. They were eating breakfast and she started choking on meat, some kind of meat. It's never really explained. And they can't stop her from choking. The Heimlich doesn't work. In all honesty, the novel doesn't really go into a lot of what happens there. But they call an ambulance. The ambulance is taking a long time to get there, and they start to worry that she's going to die from choking before the ambulance even arrives. So they try to perform an emergency tracheotomy on her. So they stab her in the throat, hoping to create an airway there, so that she can breathe and make it until the ambulance gets there. Unfortunately, she bleeds out from the stab wound and dies because of that before the ambulance gets there. So of course, they're both incredibly traumatized, and Julia ends up going to the psychiatric hospital to deal with that. And then the novel begins just as she's been released. But instead of going home to her husband, she decides to buy her own house in London and live independently. Turns out that Julia Lofting is very wealthy. The money in their marriage comes from her. She inherited it all from her parents. And right away, we start to see signs of haunting in the house. She sees figures running past her just out of the corner of her eye. Her heaters are always turned up to full blast, even though she turns them off over and over again. The heaters are always back on, and the house is swelteringly hot throughout most of the novel. Very uncomfortable. It turns out that Magnus and his sister Lily, Magnus is her husband. It turns out that her husband Magnus and her sister-in-law, his sister Lily, are both dependent on her money. And they really, really don't want to lose that. So they both start scheming to try and get Julia to go back to her husband Magnus. Which creates the kind of crux in the novel where is it a psychological thriller or is it a supernatural horror? Because her husband Magnus is constantly walking around the house, breaking into the house, so you don't know if it's the haunting that Julia's seeing or if it's her husband. And that is one of the mysteries that kind of keep you reading through the book. If you like either one of these genres, supernatural horror or psychological thrillers, you will love this book, and I do highly recommend that you read it. Okay, here is what I loved about the book, and I'm just going to break this down into a couple of small parts. First, I loved the prose. Peter Straub's education was in English, and he taught English for a small amount of time. He obviously loves literature. He loves poetry. He's written both. His first two novels were mainstream literature, and his prose really shows that. And I think that set him up as a very unique horror writer. I'm not used to eloquence of this level in a horror novel, and I found that page after page there were wonderful quotes that just stick with you throughout this novel. Very well written, very very well structured craft by Peter Straub in this novel. The setting is wonderful. The whole thing takes place in London, and you can tell that he uh, went there as an American and fell in love with the city, because he has Julia Lofting go through the same thing. She's an American living in London, and it is so well written that I think you could almost take a walking tour of this novel, and all the places that he brings up. The house is also described very well. It's very scary. It has 8 rooms, but we only really see the downstairs, the front room, the kitchen, the stairs, and then a lot of the action takes place, the haunting action takes place in her room, which is upstairs. And it's a very scary house. There's a point when her husband is there trying to go upstairs, and the description of how the house is terrifying him without anything happening is incredible. The type of thing that can't be shown in movies. One of the reasons that I appreciate both horror movies and horror novels is because they are different mediums and different things can be shown in each. And in this specific case, the house, the scary atmosphere is all psychological, and would be very difficult to show in a movie, which we'll talk about when I talk about the movie of this book. Characters. The interesting thing about this book is that each character, I felt, embodied a concept, but not only that, each character embodied a concept and a negative or opposite or extreme of that concept. A lot of the characters in this are incredible, and I have read some reviews that say that some of the side characters in this novel are more caricatures. They're not really fleshed out characters, and I think that can be argued only because I think that he was using characters to create analogies of ideas, and I think that went really well and it really worked out. But it did have the unfortunate side effect of making some characters not as well-rounded as they could be. Just to start with Julia Lofting, I think that at the beginning of the novel, she embodies the concept of logic. She doesn't believe in the spirituality that her sister-in-law is trying to get her involved in. She doesn't seem to be a religious woman. She seems to be a woman that believes in the facts in front of her. So I think that Julia is kind of made throughout this entire novel to represent logical thinking. And of course, the opposite and extreme that she goes to is the concept of being haunted, which is a concept of faith, an opposite of logic, right? She has to have faith that this is not her mind falling apart, but but an actual being that is terrorizing her, and that leads, of course, to her madness and our questioning of her sanity. So she starts as logic, turns to haunting and faith, and ends up with madness. Because I do believe that Julia has gone insane throughout this novel. I don't think it's a question of is it insanity or is it a haunting. I think that a haunting would drive any sane person insane. It absolutely would, and it does her. The next character that we can look up or look at is Magnus, her husband. He is a barrister, I believe, and he deals with the law, and he is constantly described as a person of authority. That's what first attracts Julia to him, is that he has this overbearing authority to his personality that reminds Julia of her father, and that's why she marries him. Of course, throughout the novel, we see him break down into bullying and rage, the opposite of what the law and authority should be. He takes great advantage of his power throughout this novel and is a terrifying character. He wants Julia back, and he is very used to getting his own way. And that is his madness. And we see him have breakdowns throughout the novel, just like we do Julia. All these characters have breakdowns throughout the novel. The next character that I really enjoyed was Lily Lofting. That is Magnus's sister, Julia's sister-in-law. She represents spirituality specifically through the concept of mediums, knowing about connecting with the dead, speaking with the dead, talking through to ghosts. This is what she is an expert at. And of course, the opposite of that is her extreme manipulation. She manipulates Magnus and Julia, and even their other brother Mark, who we'll get to in a second, throughout this entire novel. So, Mark. Mark is Magnus and Lily's adopted brother. So Julia's brother-in-law. She's also kind of a love interest throughout this book. And he is portrayed as a kind of a free spirit. And he's connected to meditation and Buddhism. And the kind of opposite extreme that he goes through is a really intense narcissism. He, like his brother Magnus, is always used to getting what he wants. But in his case, he uses his really high charisma to get what he wants instead of an overbearing power of authority. Unfortunately, this leads to, in his case, a very narcissistic personality. And within this novel, I think that he commits rape twice, once almost and once completely, on Julia. Rough kind of read. That part of the novel was not my favorite part. But it just really goes to show how he uses this free spirit, meditation, loving life to really get what he wants, which is what all of these Loftings have a tendency to do in this novel. And I want to look a little bit at the character of Olivia, who's the ghost in this novel. I'm not giving any spoilers of the end yet. It becomes apparent right away, very, very quickly within the novel, that Olivia is the ghost. And when I talk about her character, I'm going to talk specifically about her historical character. The way she was before she died and a little bit after. Her character represents pure evil, but also innocence. So again, we've got that weird juxtaposition of ideas connected to character. Olivia died when she was 11, and the life that she led was really gory. She tortured animals, she was psychotic, and she started killing people, children. I think that, and I was not able to confirm this, but I found this in a lot of reviews, and I agree with all the other reviewers that stated this. I think that this is based on, I think her name is Mary Bell, England's youngest murderess, who killed a preschool children and went to prison for it. And I think that that's who Olivia is based on. And it looks at the concept of evilness and how it really should not exist in a child, but it does in Olivia. So next, I'd like to go through some themes that I feel run very strongly throughout this book. The first one is the theme of finding yourself after divorce or after separating from somebody. And I found that this whole book was almost an analogy for what it means to separate from somebody you've been married to for a really long time. There's a quote on page 28 in my copy that I'd like to read to you really quick. She could not afford to think that way. If she had been garrulous, disorganized, sloppy, everything that Magnus had accused her of being, perhaps these qualities were wrong only to Magnus. She had a right to her own foibles, and even now, free from him for only 2 days, Julia could simply feel how oppressive Magnus's values had been. She said to herself, "I think it means my marriage is over," and surprised herself with the thought. Leaving Magnus had everything to do with Kate's death, of course, that horrific scene on the kitchen floor, Kate's blood everywhere, boiling out of her panicked body, but leaving him, Julia now thought, might also come from a deep knowledge that marriage to Magnus was no longer possible. Really, Kate had kept them together. Kate had been their focus. So in this quote, I think that we can see a theme that plays throughout the entire novel of Julia trying to separate herself from her husband. Of course, her husband does not want this, but neither does her sister-in-law, her husband's sister, so, mainly because, of course, they want to keep getting the money. But they're not just evil people. They also care about Julia, but they really don't want to let her go. And the entire novel is her struggle to get away from them, and how much his baggage, and we'll get into that in a minute, keeps her there in the marriage. And I liked that theme. I felt like it was an interesting theme. Anybody that's been divorced will know how hard that is, whether you're the one that initiates it or whether you're the one that's going through it and didn't want it. It is a process, and I think that this book really accurately analogizes what that process could or feels like as you go through it. All right. The next section, the next theme I'm going to look at does have spoilers. I am going to spoil certain aspects of the book. So if you do not want this aspects of the book spoiled, don't watch the next part. Go ahead and skip forward. The next theme that I found ran all the way through this book connects back to the character of Olivia, who I was talking about earlier, and evil versus innocence. It is very unique to have a child ghost at this time. I know that a lot of ghosts are children now in a lot of the media, but back then, the idea The Exorcist having it be a child that was possessed, that was new and terrifying. And then having Julia be a child, or having Olivia be a child in this book, is also kind of a new concept, because we don't usually associate children with evil. And in this book, he asks us to do just that. I'm going to read a quick quote, and then we'll talk about kind of how he deals with this concept. This is Julia thinking. Little girls so pretty did not do things like that. It was an unfair psychological rule that handsome children were healthier and more stable than ugly ones. In fact, Julia allowed the idea to seep cautiously into articulation. She had been upset because the sight of the turtle reminded her of what had happened to Kate. So in this quote, she's discussing the fact that she saw Olivia's ghost, although she didn't realize it was a ghost, mutilate and kill a turtle. And she can't believe that could be true, because pretty young children don't behave like that. And this runs all the way throughout the book. Olivia does terrible things to animals and to people, and she sees it occur. Julia does through haunted moments. She sees the past play out, and has to kind of deal with this concept. And it's really interesting because the film version and the book version have two different ways of dealing with this concept. The book version, she just has to eventually accept that Olivia is evil, that she has been targeted by evil, and that she needs to do everything in her power to get away from it. Whereas the movie version, and I'll just kind of bring this up right now, I saw this film first, and it did make me want to watch this. It's not the most terrifying film, but it is very spooky and very well done. This is my 4K copy. It's called The Haunting of Julia here in America. And the movie deals with the evil of the child in a different way, in that even though the child is evil, the character of Julia feels like she needs to mother it in order to make it better. So Julia chooses to be killed by the ghost in order to become a mother to the ghost itself. This is a concept that has actually become kind of a trope in horror novels and movies now. I just was watching a Dark Water, which is directed by the same Japanese director that did The Ring. I can't think of his name right off the top of my head, sorry. But even in that one, we see this woman choosing to die to become the mom of a ghost child that has been left behind. So yeah, Julia, that's how The Haunting of Julia comes at this theme of innocence versus evil. In this book, that doesn't occur. Julia does not want to die. Julia hates being haunted by this ghost, and there's times when she may feel a connection to it, but that's only because Olivia looks a lot like Kate, her daughter that died. So yeah, they in order to flush this out, basically what Peter Straub says is children can be evil. It can occur, and that is just something we have to accept. And I think that was probably came from him looking at the Mary Bell murders and going, wow, how do you try a case where a child has killed another child? How difficult is that? And the novel kind of connects to that as well. One aspect that I wasn't such a huge fan of was that it also looked at the concept of sexuality. A lot of time is spent well, not a lot of time, but there's quite a few occurrences in the novel that consider Olivia from a sexual perspective. The children that she used to hang out with, when Julia goes and finds them and interviews them, one of them says that she taught them everything about sex, that she was a very sexual being. And then in the hauntings themselves, there are kind of sex scenes where Olivia is caressing Julia, and it gets very uncomfortable and very weird. One of the aspects of the book that I didn't think was needed. If Peter Straub felt like he wanted to make us question the concept of children and sexuality, he could have brought it up. He didn't need to go into such detailed scenes of that. The last theme that I want to talk about in this book that I found really enjoyable is what it means to be a woman of that time. And I think that Peter Straub did half a good job and kind of half a bad job at this. I'll start with a quote. Julia is walking through the streets, and the haunting has really had quite an effect on her, and she's starting to see things differently than they actually are. Men followed her with their eyes. Before her, as she watched them quicken with lust or amusement, what in the world can I look like, she wondered. They drew their faces into the masks of beasts, boars, bulls, wild dogs. Bristles jutted from their snouts. Their feet were hooves tearing the ground. Their skin burned in the yellow light. unhealthy and sallow. In the babble of voices, she thought she discerned Magnus's low growl and started, her mind a fluttering rag. This happens a lot in this novel. Every male interaction that Julia has is almost over the top in the men trying to decide what Julia can do for them, and it's always money or sex every time. So Julia is constantly navigating a world where everybody that meets her decides what she has to be for them, and what it does is starts to paint what she sees the world around her as. And I think that for 1970s, this was really forward thinking. I'm going to read one more quote before I go on from this. 4 young men passed before her, their hair languorously curled. As they turned to stare, she saw their faces inflamed with pustules, death in the pouches of their cheeks, their eyes like razors, cutting pieces from her body. Now, this concept of her body being parted out by the eyes of the men relates directly to feminist literary theory, and I'm sure that this is something that he studied as he was being educated in America and probably in Dublin as well. And he really presents this very well, right? This fracturing of women's bodies by how they are seen through the eyes of men. A man looking at this part of her body or that part of the body as she passes, she feels like she's being cut to pieces. And that kind of prose, I think, really presents that really well. And that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about this novel with Peter Straub, with Peter Straub's writing. But if we connect this with the kind of becoming her own person, and that earlier quote I read about her saying, well, maybe all of what Magnus called my clumsiness and my foibles are my own, and I should be able to embrace those. He creates a really strong woman in Julia. He really does. But then, unfortunately, a lot of her actions are obviously, I think, written from a male point of view. She's constantly forgetting things and, accidentally locking her keys in the car and so on and so forth. That she comes across as somebody that actually does need somebody to take care of them. And I feel like that kind of did a disservice to the strength that he initially gave her. But I do think Peter Straub was trying to write a really strong female character. And I think that although it has got the sexism of its time stamped on it, that in the long run he did a really good job. I find thoughts and ideas in this book to be really ahead of their time. And I really appreciated that. All right. One more spoiler, although a lot of those were spoilers. We got to talk about the end of this novel. It starts as a very structured haunted house story. The novel breaks down until the last part is a fever dream, and I had to read through it twice to really figure out my interpretation of what Peter Straub was saying. Is it possession? Is it haunting? Is it madness? And I think the answer is that it's all three of those things. The world is very complicated, and I think he brought that complication into the novel. He didn't just want a simple haunting story. He wanted to create a world that shows all the effects and problems with a haunting and a possession in the real world. So, it brings up tons of questions. Mark is the brother of Julia's husband, Magnus, and also kind of a love interest throughout the novel. But he's been meditating, and he meets a psychic early on in the novel, and she says that he's an empty vessel waiting to be filled. and Julia starts to believe that he might be the one that is possessed and killing off Olivia's old schoolmates. Of course, the novel points to Julia as well, but as I read it, I feel like it was very much Marcus. I feel like those signposts that Straub put in there of Mark meditating and losing himself and losing time, and the psychic saying that he's an empty vessel waiting to be filled. I think that really points to him being the murderer throughout the novel. Um, but it could be Julia. Julia eventually ends up wanting to take sleeping pills and go home. She writes a note that says, "I'm not suicidal. If I am found dead, I was murdered by either Mark Lofting or Magnus Lofting." And she puts that note in her room. And unfortunately, she does die. And the book doesn't tell us how she dies. It doesn't give any gory details at all. We don't know if it was pills or stabbing or cutting or whatever. We don't know how she dies. All we do know is that Mark was heading for her house, and that she's dead in the next chapter. I believe my personal interpretation is that she was killed by the ghost Olivia, which is how the movie ends as well. But I think that the ghosts killed her out of vengeance and not desire for motherhood as the movie would have it. So we have these two different endings, the movie with the motherhood and the book with this kind of fear of death and just the violence of evil that is visited upon Julia. A lot of people complain about the end. I think it's absolutely incredible. I do believe that you have to go back and read it twice if you want to really delve into it. A first reading, it feels like a fever dream and you miss lots of interesting aspects. But on the second reading through, it seemed so much clearer and so much more enjoyable. I think, really anybody can like this novel. It is not your typical horror fare. The prose take a little bit more attention to follow along with, and the plot is a little more challenging than your regular haunted house story. If I were to rate this book, I would rate it an 8 out of 10 very easily. Wonderful experience. Really enjoyed reading it. All right, if you enjoyed this, please give it a like. If you like content like this, please subscribe to our channel, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.